Hi, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a little bit. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. Help me help you, Idaho's new approach to RFIs, which was the 2022 Cronin Awards Silver Prize winning project. Thank you for spending some time with us today. We're glad you're here. This is the first webinar in our 2022 Cronin Awards series, so be sure to check out our upcoming webinars. Next Wednesday, January 18th, join us for our second webinar and learn about Michigan's competitive proof of concept approach to IT procurement. Then join us on Wednesday, February 1st, for a look at Tennessee's Supplier Diversity Interactive Data Dashboard. Registration is open for all of the webinars in the series. Visit www.naspo.org to register and look for the webinars tab on the left side of the page. Chadwick is also going to drop the link into the chat for easy access. We look forward to seeing you there. At the close of today's presentation, you will be asked to complete a brief survey. Your feedback is very valuable to us here at NASPO. Today's presentation is good for 1 contact hour. To get your certificate, simply complete the survey following the presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to explain the format of today's webinar. First, all attendees are muted. You can enter comments and questions in the chat box. If you would like to ask our presenters a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. Questions will be addressed during the Q&A session after the presentation. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Today, we are honored to have with us Valerie Bollinger, who is the Chief Procurement Officer with the state of Idaho. She is also a NASPO board member and this year's president-elect. Valerie has been with the state for about 10 years and was previously a practicing attorney. We also have Bob Morlan, who is the purchasing supervisor with the State Office of Idaho. Bob has been with the state for over 12 years and was previously in private procurement for 14 years. Now, let's get started. First, NASPO, is great to have you here with us, and I'm going to turn it over to Valerie to take us away.
Thanks, Megan. Great to see, well, not really see everybody today, but great to have you all with us. We're excited to share this presentation. So to start out, kind of talking about our new RFI process, we wanted to start by talking about our old RFI process, or traditional, I guess, is the nicer way to say it, just so that everybody understands the problem that we were trying to solve. So our traditional RFI process in Idaho, we would provide a detailed description of the state's requirements that could often be pretty lengthy and take a lot of time to put together, and honestly kind of looked like what I would call a mini RFP almost, right? It went into sometimes a lot of detail on what the state was looking for. The RFI would then request written responses from suppliers, asking for industry information related to what we expected would eventually be a solicitation. So that's kind of where we started. And we had identified 3 primary problems with this traditional RFI process. The first was that it took too long. So agencies were rarely willing to tack on 2 to 3 months at the beginning of a procurement timeline, especially because usually their timeline was, we need it yesterday, right? So if we said to them, sorry, you need it yesterday, but can we add 2 to 3 months to an already really long procurement cycle time? And they often didn't want to go for that. The second problem that we often had was that we just didn't get a lot of vendors responding. And in kind of getting feedback from vendors over the years, there were two primary reasons. One was that if a vendor, like most states or all states that I know of, vendors also have limited resources. And if they're having to choose what project to put their resources into as far as their time, if the time is limited or if their resources are limited, they're going to put their effort toward an RFP where they might get a contract at the end of the day, not into an RFI where they know they're not going to get a contract. So a lot of times it was just a resource issue. The other concern that vendors expressed to us was that even though they were allowed to identify trade secrets in their RFI response, which then we would not, provide in response to a public record request, the Idaho definition of a trade secret is not nearly as expansive as what vendors would like it to be. So they were concerned that they would be kind of showing their hand to their competitors if they responded to the RFI and then we provided that response in response to a public record request. So they were a little bit hesitant to share too much information. And then the third problem was when we did get responses from vendors, usually what we got was a lot of marketing material. It was a sales pitch. And so, we might find a couple little nuggets of useful information in there that would help with the solicitation. But largely what happened is if we did an RFI at all, we spent months to get very little, and what we got provided very little value. So we had really moved away from doing RFIs very often. The other issue that we sometimes ran into was that if we did get vendor responses and all those fancy marketing materials, sometimes the agency subject matter experts ended up with a favorite, right? They liked one response that they saw to the RFI, and then going into the procurement process, it became that much harder to have a genuinely fair, open, competitive procurement process. So those are all kind of the issues that we were dealing with RFIs, and that's what led us into our new RFI process. So the new process is it's a lot shorter, and I'm actually going to show you a screenshot of an actual RFI that we did, the first one that we did like this. It provides an overview of the state's requirements with a focus on unique challenges. So none of those detailed specs or anything like that, really just kind of high level, what is this all about? And a focus on what makes our project unique. We do not require any written response from suppliers. In fact, we tell them not to provide us a written response. And instead, we conduct up to 5 virtual interviews. So we basically open up these interview spots on a first come, first serve basis. And then we ask the vendors a series of questions, and Bob's going to go into more detail on those questions in a couple of minutes here. But we basically ask the suppliers to help us develop a good solicitation. So instead of asking them, what can you do for us? We're asking them, what can we do for you in our solicitation? What can we do in our solicitation that will allow you to give us a really good proposal? So just so you can get a visual, obviously you're not gonna be able to read all of this. I don't expect you to, although if you want a copy, you can by all means let us know and we'll be happy to provide it. So this is actual screenshot of the first RFI we ever did like this. As you can see, it's a grand total of 5 pages. And in terms of actual written content, it's 3.5 pages. And one of those pages are the questions, which are standard. They don't even change very much, at least from RFI to RFI. So in terms of what you actually have to do on any given RFI, you're basically looking at section 2 of this document, which you can see takes up a total of 2 pages, basically. Background information, unique or challenging conditions, future goals and outcomes, and the upcoming solicitation. That's it. And then all the vendor has to do is fill out page 5 with their information and when they would be available for a 1-hour virtual meeting. So it's really simple, really straightforward, and so much faster. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about the specific questions that we asked during this new RFI process.
Yeah, thanks, Valerie. The specific questions we ask, we're just trying to get information so that we can write something up to get good responses. So like one of the first ones is, what is the most critical information the state needs to provide for our current conditions? I mean, based on the write-up that we did on the form, what do they need to know in order to provide information back to us so that we can write good specifications? And then we also want to know, what about our future requirements? What do they need to know in order to, provide those long-term goals that we might have? What information is it that will help them get that to us? Then we ask, what are the 3 to 5 most critical personnel that need to be on the project to make it successful? It could be anywhere from like sales engineers to project managers, what I've seen. So we just need to know that, so we call that out. We're not asking for something that isn't a typical industry standard. And then one of the things that was really helpful to us is, what is the best way for us to collect costing information? We need to be able to compare this apples to apples, and sometimes the subject matter experts they think they know what the best way is, but when we post it and get questions, we find out it's not the best way. So this is a great way to help us put those together and save some time in that Q&A period. And then we want to know what they think about our scheduled timelines. Are they realistic? Are they too tight? Are they just right? Or what? So we want to make sure we're not, making it so that there's no way that anybody could complete this project within the time frame that we've put out there. And then we also ask, is there anything else that we need to consider at this time? Is there anything future-wise that they're seeing in their industry that we wouldn't know about, or maybe the subject matter experts may not be aware of either? That way, potentially, we can capture that information and use that to make, a better specifications as well.
Yeah, so the example that I kind of screenshotted on the previous slide, there's a great example from that experience that I want to share about the schedule timelines. And this really speaks to, I think, the value of doing these virtual calls as opposed to a written response. And Bob, you may have some examples you want to share too. But this one is so visual in my mind that it's just a great example. On this first timeline, or on the first RFI we did, was for our employee group health insurance plan. So our health plan for the whole state, which is obviously, as people keep reminding me, extremely important to every employee who works for the state. So I better not screw it up. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. This is a huge project, really complex. And we had a timeline that was our ideal timeline. And it was with the goal of having the new insurance plan available at the start of our next plan year, which is the start of our next fiscal year. And so we kind of had that timeline laid out, and we asked, just as Bob said, we asked the question, well, what do you think about this timeline, right? If we award here and you have to implement by this time, and we have to be able to get it into the state system for open enrollment at this time of year, and then it goes live, July 1st. And almost every single vendor, hopefully you can all see me because this is so visual. Basically every vendor said, sure, we can do that. Right? They said what they thought we wanted to hear, which was, sure, we can meet your timeline. And their faces and voices all said, no, we can't meet that timeline, which was really important for us to know, because it helped shape the way that we put the solicitation together. Was, we said, in a perfect world, we would love to be able to go live for the next plan year. However, we're not going to hold it against you if you can't do that, right? We're not going to evaluate your proposed schedule as long as it's not going to be more than one additional year out. And it was a really tight timeline. We knew that going in, that it was, maybe going to be tough for people to meet that. But having the virtual meetings, all but guarantee if we'd asked for a written response to these questions, the vendors would have said, yes, we can meet this timeline. And then they would have had a really hard time meeting the timeline. Or they would have proposed solutions that were much less innovative, knowing that they couldn't meet the timeline with a bigger change, but something similar to what our current plan looks like, they might be able to do. So having that, the visual cues and just hearing their voices when they talked about it, gave us much better information than if we had just gotten a written response. Bob, was there any other examples that you wanted to provide from some of the ones that you've done?
Yeah, one of the other ones would be like into regards to future requirements. We did one for the security and camera system for the state liquor division, and we went through there and they hadn't really even contemplated putting cameras with door locks and having that all automated. So that's some of the things that came out of that were, the AI, facial recognition, how do you want this to look like in the future, because there are all these new technologies coming out, which was very helpful for us to, consider that so that we could actually contemplate that in our RFP so that if that does come on, we can capture that in the future.
Awesome. So I'm going to go through some of the benefits that we've seen since we implemented this new process, and then Bob's going to talk. So Bob's team is the team that is actually primarily doing these new RFIs. I did the first one, but Bob's team has taken over doing all of them since. So he's going to talk about some of the lessons learned. If I can figure out how to advance the slide. Yes. Okay. So we've seen like really 3 obvious benefits from this new RFI process. So the first one is increased efficiency, and I already talked about this or at least alluded to it a little bit at the beginning. So with our traditional RFI process, and this is probably being a little bit optimistic, but we probably were adding 3 to 4 months onto the total cycle time of a project. Because there was so much more detail, so much more information in the RFI itself, that RFI development, time period would take some time. It would take the agency putting their time into it, and then if we were going to actually run the RFI out of our office, the central procurement office, we would review it. So there was a fair amount of time there. Then we would post the RFI, and because we were asking for written responses to questions, we would have to have it out there for at least a month and sometimes longer. If we really wanted to get responses, right, the longer you give vendors, the more likely they might take the time to respond. And then if we did actually get responses full of all sorts of beautiful sales fluff, we had to take time to review those responses and then do something with it. Otherwise, what was the point of all this? So we were looking at, let's just say roughly 3 months to do the RFI process. With the new RFI process, it's so much faster because it's so much simpler, right? So that you saw that document is about 3.5 pages, and really only about 2 of those pages are actually different from RFI to RFI. So really quick development, right? The agency can do those couple of pages really quickly. Typically, when it comes over to us, we can review it and get it posted. It doesn't take a lot of time generally for us to do that, unless the agency is arguing with us about the questions, but Bob might talk about that in lessons learned. So I'll leave that alone. And then once we post the RFI, we really don't have to have it out there for very long because the vendors don't have to respond. They just need time to see that it's there, read 3.5 pages of information, and then send us that one form that says, yeah, we'd like to participate. Here's when we're available. And we take the first 5 vendors who respond. We do have language in the RFI that says we reserve the right to meet with more than 5 if they might bring a different perspective. So using the health insurance example again, we had kind of talked ahead of time, if the first 5 vendors that register to do a meeting are all medical insurance providers. And then number 6 is just a pharmacy benefit manager, right? A PBM. We would probably bring in number 6 because we would want to hear that different perspective of a PBM versus medical provider. And so we have that standard language that kind of gives us that opportunity to bring in additional vendors if we want to. So that's there, but we really do try to keep it at 5 because what we have found is that once you get past number 3, about 90% of what you hear is repeat. It's really not efficient anymore if you do more than 5 because you're hearing the same information over and over and over again, because it's not about the vendor and what they can do. It's about the state and what we need to put in our solicitation. And that actually doesn't vary nearly as much. And then the last, the end of the process, once we have those meetings, we conduct those meetings. It's a, grand total of 5 hours spread throughout a couple of days, usually. Take a little bit of time to consolidate the notes. So the actual record that we have at the end of this is a set of consolidated notes that identifies, here are things that we heard repeatedly from multiple vendors. Here are some things that were sort of one-off, things that we heard. And sometimes we would end up with notes about things that weren't even something that a vendor specifically said, but just something that kind of came out in conversation that we wanted to make note of when we got to the actual solicitation development. So that whole process only takes a few weeks, and then that's it, we're done. So it saves, I would say, easily 5 to 6 weeks of time as far as cycle time. The other thing is the actual effort level, how much time we're putting into the work. So this is just a really rough, estimate of, like a buyer at the central procurement office, how much time they save, and that meaning the amount of time they would have spent on a traditional RFI versus the amount of time they would spend on this new RFI. What's the saved time, and how that equates to cost savings from a personnel perspective. And obviously that's going to depend, a lot on how many of these RFIs you're doing and your staff and who's doing the work and how much they make and that kind of thing. But just certainly gives an example of some of the savings from a resource perspective. The next benefit that we found was reduced delay and disruption during the solicitation process when we actually get to the RFP or whatever kind of solicitation it is. And the best way I can talk about this is an example. So we early in 2022 had a very large solicitation for complex behavioral health contract. We did not use this RFI process with that procurement. And when we did our Q&A, we got something like 110 questions. And of those 110 questions, a lot of them were asking for data. And we had provided what we thought was a fair amount of data just from the start, right? The data that we thought vendors would care about. But it turns out they wanted a whole lot more. And so, we got those questions, and the agency, the program folks who had to pull that data basically had to drop everything to get all of this data pulled together so that we could get it posted in time, fast enough to keep our procurement timeline on track. And so that was very disruptive. We didn't delay that particular procurement, but only because the team working on it was fantastic and literally dropped everything to get it done. But a lot of times agencies can't do that, or won't do that. And so we end up, we've had other solicitations where it takes us 3 or 4 weeks to answer questions instead of the week that we aim for, because we just can't get the data. So this new RFI process, that's a big part of the questions that Bob went through, is asking them, what do you need from us? What do you need to know? And so with the health insurance procurement, we knew what data they wanted up front. We were able to get that data from our current carrier, from our actuary, wherever we needed to get that data, so that we had it when we posted the solicitation. And we had a lot fewer questions like that when it came to the actual procurement process. And then finally, just increased competition. And I don't have data to back this up, but I do have a lot of, I don't have numbers, but I do have a lot of anecdotal information, which is that suppliers have shared that they love this process. Every supplier I've talked to about this new RFI process loves it. Because of the way that we're doing it, I think some of the feedback that I've gotten is suppliers feel like it demonstrates to them that we have not pre-selected a vendor, we don't have a specific solution in mind, that we're not trying to make the procurement process harder than it has to be. I know sometimes people think that, but I swear it's not true, right? We're trying to make this as easy for them as we can. And so that has come through to the vendors that they really like this opportunity to have a conversation and give some input into what can we do in the procurement to the solicitation to make it easier for them to actually give us a good proposal. And what we found is suppliers don't always take advantage of the Q&A, right? So some suppliers do, and we get those huge questions for lots of data, and that's really disruptive. But the flip side of that is that the vendors don't ask questions at all, and then they get to the end and they are making assumptions that aren't correct, or they don't write a good proposal because they didn't ask good questions, they don't have good information. So doing this in advance, they sort of sit up and take notice and get a lot of those questions answered ahead of time. And so we found that to be really, really beneficial in terms of getting more competition and better, right? Better proposals, because they had the opportunity to help us write a good solicitation, help us do a good job for them. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Bob to talk about some of the lessons learned that his team has seen.
Yeah, so some of the lessons learned that we've had is, we tell the suppliers up front when we get in the meeting, we're not going to answer questions. So getting that across to your agencies, that can be hard because your natural instinct is to, but why? So it's really hard. And the reason we do that is just to make sure that everything's fair, because everybody might not ask the same questions in every meeting. So we don't want to give the impression that we're not being fair in these calls. As the slide says, set good expectations with agency and suppliers. With the suppliers, you have to keep letting them know, hey, this is not an opportunity for a sales pitch. Please, let's stick to answering the questions. And sometimes I've had to, restate the question several times. Hey, how are we going to, what information do you need from us to do this? And it can be pretty hard. So if you have a staff member that's not strong in that, keeping things on track, you might want to help coach them before you let them go on one of these. But it can be hard, and it's hard with the agencies keeping them on track, because they'll try to ask questions that completely dive you into the actual proposal piece, and you have to push them back and say, no, we're not gonna do that. So and then some of the other things is, prepare your agencies up front that we're going to stick to the questions. We're not going to modify the questions to fit something that would get us to where they're actually telling us what to write on the proposal as far as all the information we have, and then what information can they give us to make it almost seem like we're writing it for them. So those are really tough. Because agencies, they're really wanting the best thing, and we totally get that, but it's really hard to keep them in line on some of these. But if you set it up front in your initial meetings, as you get through it and get to the presentations, they'll come around. But occasionally you'll still have to corral them in the meetings. Did you have any other examples that you might have had, Valerie?
I think just one other thing that kind of popped into my head is making sure that the person leading these meetings has really good listening skills. And I don't just mean like they listen and take notes, but really listen to what is being communicated, not just what's being said, if that makes sense. So I had one experience on actually a different one that I did. The first one that we did, the first project we did this for was the employee group health insurance. The second one that we did, I led the meetings, but Bob and his team all were participants in those meetings so that they could sort of get the experience of seeing how to run the meeting, how it works, get that experience firsthand of seeing how the meetings go. So it was on one of those meetings where Bob's team was sort of joining in. We had a vendor who had a particularly hard time understanding that this was not a sales pitch. This was about helping us write a good solicitation. But one thing that I heard loud and clear was they said, oh, it's really important. You have to have a vendor that has Idaho experience, and went into this whole spiel about how the vendor has to have Idaho specific experience. Well, of course, this was a vendor that is currently a contractor doing some of this type of work in Idaho, right? No surprise there. But the note that I made in my notes was, we need to make sure that we don't limit this to Idaho experience, because it was very clear that the vendor was trying to get us to write the solicitation in a way that was going to favor them. But it had the opposite effect, right? In that it gave me the red flag of they're trying to manipulate this process in a way that benefits them, but they didn't actually make a compelling argument for why the vendor needed to have Idaho experience. So it's really important to just, for whoever's running these meetings, to be really, really paying attention and listening and understanding what is being said and what the motive is behind what's being said, and then have good conversation with the agency afterwards, in that debrief about kind of what to do with the information that they've received. I think it can be easy for people to take a more passive role and just sort of like run the meeting, but my experience has been, don't count on the agency to pick up on some of those more subtle cues related to the procurement process. The procurement professional needs to be picking up on those subtle cues that help make sure that in the end, we can write a solicitation that's going to get the best solution for the state, and run a process, obviously, that's fair. So that's the only thing that I would add. Bob, did you have anything else that you wanted to share?
No.
So that's the end of our slides. I imagine that there are questions out there, so I'm going to turn it over to the NASPO folks to start asking questions.
Great, thank you, Valerie. Great presentation. There has been a ton of requests for the RFIs and the slides, so everybody is very, very interested. Just wanted to let you know that we will be sending out a copy of the slide deck, and then additionally, the presentation will be available on our YouTube channel as well. And you can also access that through our content library. So you will be able to go back through and review. Okay.
Megan, I can provide the template. Bob or I can provide the template, our RFI template as well, if you want to provide that with those materials, so that we don't have to provide it to everyone separately.
That would be perfect. We can send it out with the slide deck, so that email will follow shortly. Maybe we need a little bit more time just to make sure we get the RFI and have it attached. So be patient, please. Okay, so I will start with our first question. Do you allow the vendors to ask you questions during the RFI? So I think, yeah, I'll let you.
Yeah, so we encourage vendors to ask questions during the RFI process, but we don't answer them. which sounds so horrible when I say those words, but it's totally true. So what we tell the vendors is, like, and this was a lessons learned first time out of the gate. I hadn't really thought about it. And then a vendor asked a question and the agency SME started to answer. And I was like, no, don't answer that question. So we started kind of making that the disclaimer at the beginning. We're not going to answer questions because we don't want, because of first come, first serve, the first 5 vendors happen to have this information and everybody else is out of luck, right? Until we issue the procurement. So we don't answer the questions, but we do actually encourage the vendors to ask us their questions so that we can write them down and make sure that we're answering them preemptively, proactively when we issue the solicitation. It feels very unnatural, but it actually has worked really well. We get great information from their questions, but it is very weird to refuse to answer them.
And do you see that people are starting to pick up on that process? So they're understanding that you're not going to answer, but there is that incorporation later, or is it still a work in progress?
I know, Bob, what do you think? You've done the more recent ones.
It depends. It all depends on the supplier. Some of them listen and just will, ask, and then they'll say, oh yeah, that's right, you're not going to answer the questions. And some of them just don't. They just want to ask and try to keep asking. So it's kind of it just depends.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, our next question. Did your state work with the Center for Procurement Excellence on this or another vendor?
Yeah, so it did. It started out with a project that we were working on with Center for Procurement Excellence, and then we kind of took what they had provided us and then made it our own and implemented it kind of across the board for all of our RFIs, kind of introduced that out to the state. So yeah, it did start with a specific project where they made a recommendation to us and then we kind of took it from there.
And then just to follow up on that, with implementing this process, do you have any specific advice for states about how they can take this model and implement it?
I think, and Bob, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this too. I think the biggest thing, we started out kind of small. And so right now, only our office is running these, and we have plans to do training with our agencies so that they can run these as well. But I think there is a risk associated with doing RFIs this way, because if you do answer questions, or if you do end up treating it more like an opportunity for a sales pitch, it opens up some possibility of kind of providing an unfair advantage to the vendors who happen to respond first, right? And so I think the biggest thing is training and making sure that the people running these meetings understand the process, that they understand those risks, and that they have the skills to manage the meetings in a way that sort of mitigates that risk. So I think that's the biggest thing, is to not just sort of throw it out there as a thing that people can do without I think the training is really, really important. So for right now, we are only doing this internally. And we have had requests from several agencies to be able to run these on their own. And we're kind of doing it slowly because we want to make sure that we train them correctly first. Bob, I don't know if you have anything else.
Yeah, currently we have one with our Department of Correction. It's for like food catering, to buy food for their catering units, and we're gonna run it, but we're gonna have them sit with us so that we can show them the process, and then we can train them while we're doing it, kind of a job shadow type of thing. And usually what I've been seeing is people are reluctant for the new process because they don't understand it, but then once they go through it, they're like, wow, we really got a lot of good information out of this. This actually does work. So it's always that it's a new thing, so nobody wants to do it until they've done it and see what the benefits are.
Absolutely. All too familiar, right? And then just kind of two additional questions regarding information sharing. Our audience wants to know, do you record these meetings, and is it possible that you could record them for training?
So we do not record them. And that is partially because, kind of going back to one of the initial concerns that vendors had expressed about our traditional RFI process, was that they're reluctant to talk to us if it's going to be public record. Now, they're not giving us as much of a sales pitch, or they shouldn't be, so that shouldn't matter as much. But so we have not recorded them historically. And if we did record them, they would be public record. And so that makes it a little bit hard. I think we'd be more likely to do a training where we have someone play the role of a vendor. And we've now done this enough that I could probably have a lot of fun being a vendor who doesn't stay on task or follow the directions at all, and make Bob try to rein me in. It would be super fun. Oh my gosh. Now I totally want to do that. Prepare yourself, Bob.
Yeah.
This is happening. So I think that's actually a great idea. I love that, of doing a video training for this, but probably not one of our actual RFI vendors, just because then it becomes the public record and all that. That's why we take all of our notes from those meetings and consolidate them into something that does not identify which vendor said what. It just sort of takes all of the information we got, put it in a consolidated format, so that that's the record that we keep from a public record perspective.
Well, we definitely want that role-playing video, so we can release that too with the RFI later. But we also have the next question, you kind of led right into it, is about those notes. Do you publish the notes that are taken during the meeting as part of the award package or something similar, or do those just remain internal?
So they remain internal unless someone requests them. So we don't proactively publish anything, but they are public record. So if someone requests those notes, then we would provide them.
Great. Thank you all. So our next question for Valerie and Bob: how often do you go through the RFI process? Do you have advice for when you should go through the RFI process and when you don't need to?
So Bob probably hates that we implemented this new RFI process, because we used to do like 1 or 2 a year maybe, and now we do them constantly, like all the time. Not all the time. We have a lot of them though that we're working on. I would say where they make sense. So we get requests to do them a lot, and probably more than we really need to. Like, I'm not sure that they're always valuable when they're requested, but where we tend to suggest them is where it's something where the agency really doesn't know exactly what they need, or doesn't know if they're making a big change, or they're not sure exactly, if it's a big technology modernization and they don't know what they're going to need, or really anything where there's a lot of data related to the project. So like I said, with the behavioral health one, we didn't do the RFI. They did an RFI, but like years ago, and not in this format. And it would have been so helpful to know what data the vendors were going to want upfront. That was really helpful with the employee group health insurance, was that we were able to prepare that data. So I don't know that there's really anything where it's not where it wouldn't be helpful. It's just sort of a balance of, is it valuable enough to be worth the time? I think that's kind of the question. Bob, what are some of the ones that your team is working on now?
So a good one, I don't know if anybody's ever done a food bid before, but that's a good one, because packaging sizes change all the time. That information from those suppliers can really help us put together good cost proposals, because we don't often know what's going on in that industry, and it changes so quick. And then we're doing one for liquor department for their shipping of the liquor throughout the state. So those are some good ones that I would say, you know, think ones that the SMEs think they know, but they're not 100% sure because there's so much volatility in the particular industry. I think we have a couple for our Medicaid programs that we'll be doing. So some of those will probably be very beneficial.
I think sometimes, and this isn't the purpose of the RFI, but it is sometimes an added benefit. And this is actually part of the reason we did it for employee group health insurance. I'm sure I hope we're not the only ones that run into this problem, that there's a lot of pressure, whether it's within the vendor community, the lobbyists, the legislature, other, wherever, pressure to see a procurement get posted, right? And sometimes that takes longer than everyone would like, and people start to get the idea that we're not really going to do it. And so for group health insurance, that procurement had actually been delayed because our, long story short, controller's office is implementing a new ERP system, and they weren't going to be able to load they weren't willing to load a new health plan into the old system just to have to transition it into the new system. So they said, you have to wait till we go with the new system. But there was rumbling within the legislature and the vendor community that was sort of just an excuse, and that really the state didn't want to procure this because we didn't want to have to change, and we weren't really going to ever compete this contract. Not true, but the rumbling was out there. The RFI actually was a really great way to let people know, no, we're really doing this, because really we're not going to sit here and have 5 hours of meetings and all of this extra time for nothing, right? We really are doing this. We're actively working on a solicitation. So it can have that added benefit of quieting some of those political concerns, and also just putting vendors on notice. It's a really good way to let them know a procurement is coming. So I think especially for large contracts, complex services, anything that's highly political, it can be really helpful.
Thank you. Okay, and something similar. So what percentage of RFPs are preceded by an RFI? And do you perform more for IT or non-IT projects?
I don't know if we have an answer to that. I'm like, let's see if Bob and I come up with the same number that we are totally making up. Gosh, I would say it's probably still only like 25%, if that we're doing RFIs. Bob, does that sound right?
Yeah, it's not a lot.
It's not a lot. It's grown significantly, but it's still not a lot. And I would say it's not that. I would say it's probably in the long run will end up being like 50-50. We've certainly done a couple for IT. Well, we've done 1 or 2 for IT. We've got a couple that are in the hopper for IT, but we've done more for complex services at this point. But I don't know. I suspect that will kind of even out over time.
All right. May I ask, have you conducted an efficiency rating system or some sort of data for the turn rates? How efficient is the new RFI process?
We have not been collecting that data. We haven't, we do cycle time on our procurement, but we have not started collecting that on our RFIs. But our procurement cycle times have been going down. I don't know if that's correlated or not, but let's pretend it is.
It's a work in progress. All right. Right. If you were trying to gather information regarding software features and capabilities available in the marketplace to assist with developing requirements, would you permit a software demonstration as part of the virtual meetings with the suppliers?
We haven't as part of this process, and So I would say we've been hesitant to do software demos pre-solicitation, in part because a lot of times then end users or the SMEs have a favorite going into the actual, they see something they like, and then it's really hard for them to not write their requirements tailored toward that solution. And that's particularly, I think, because we're not hearing from all of the potential vendors, that's not necessarily an indication that that's actually the best solution. It might be the best solution they saw, but that doesn't mean it's actually the best solution for the state. And so that we've been hesitant to do demos in that way. And I think if we were going to, we would offer it to any vendor. We wouldn't limit it to the 5, right? If we were going to say you can do a software demo, we wouldn't be able to limit it to the 5, because I think then we're moving into an area where the vendors that give us the demo have that advantage of potentially influencing how we write the requirements in a way that the RFI is not meant to do.
Well, thank you both. I'll wait just another moment for questions. That concludes most of our questions. Thank you both. Just a moment. Bob, Valerie, any final words before take it away?
I don't think so. No, I mean, we're happy to answer any questions, or, you know, reach out to us if you want to hear more about kind of what we're doing and get some, you know, more lessons learned and that sort of thing. But we're happy to provide the template and along with the slide deck so that everybody can see that. And then, yeah, that's it.
Perfect. Well, that concludes today's presentation. I want to thank our presenters, Bob Morlan and Valerie Bollinger, for a valuable information they've shared today and for working with us here at NASPO to bring it to you. So thank you for attending today's webinar. As we talked about, you will receive a follow-up email containing today's slides and the materials. Remember, this webinar qualifies as 1 contact hour for your continuing education credits. To receive your certificate, simply fill out the survey in your browser window once you've exited the webinar. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing on NASPO's YouTube page in the coming days. Questions entered into the chat box and Q&A boxes have been saved, and we will try to follow up via email from anyone that was not addressed during the presentation. Also, don't forget to check out our upcoming webinars and other events at naspo.org. Lastly, thanks again to our wonderful presenters, and thank you to our guests. Have a great rest of your day. All right.